Hello, everybody. My name is Kirsten Zickfeld, and I'm going to talk about the asymmetry in the climate carbon cycle response to positive and negative CO2 emissions. And I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Devin Azevedo, Sabine Mathesius, and Damon Matthews. Scenarios that are consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, for the most part, require net negative CO2 emissions in the second half of the century. And by net negative, I mean that carbon dioxide removals from the atmosphere exceed emissions into the atmosphere. And in this talk, I'm going to refer to carbon dioxide removals and negative emissions interchangeably. And despite the important role that net negative emissions play in pathways that are consistent with the climate limits in the Paris Agreement, there is relatively little research about climate and carbon cycle response to net negative emissions. In this talk, I'm going to answer the following research questions. Of a given amount of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, how much remains out? And is the climate carbon cycle response to a negative CO2 emission equal and opposite to the response to positive emissions, or in other words, is the response symmetric? We present results from model simulations with the UVic Earth System Climate Model, which is a model of intermediate complexity. The model was spun up under a range of atmospheric CO2 concentrations ranging from pre-industrial to 4 times the pre-industrial CO2 concentration. And from these initial states, we applied instantaneous positive and negative CO2 emission pulses of varying magnitude from plus and minus 100 gigatons of carbon to plus and minus 1,000 gigatons of carbon. In these model simulations, we assumed that carbon dioxide is removed from the Earth system permanently, and we did not specify any particular negative emission technology. And simulations are forced with CO2 only. This slide illustrates the carbon cycle response to removals of different magnitude applied from a state at equilibrium with 2 times the pre-industrial CO2 concentration. The atmospheric CO2 concentration declines very rapidly in response to the removal and then rebounds. And this response reflects the behavior of the land and ocean carbon cycles. Land loses carbon relatively quickly at first, but then after a few decades regains carbon. And this is because NPP declines very rapidly in response to the declining CO2 concentration, whereas soil respiration lags due to the delayed response in the temperature to the decline in the atmospheric CO2 concentration. Ocean also loses carbon very rapidly at first, and the loss of carbon slows down thereafter. Here we show the removal fraction as a function of the amount of removal. This is again for negative emissions applied from 2 times CO2 pre-industrial state. And these yellow stars, this is the response 100 years after the pulse, and the red stars 1,000 years after the pulse. And then here is the size of the removal or of the negative emission pulses. And so what we see is that the removal fraction, which is the ratio of the change in atmospheric carbon burden to cumulative removals, decreases with the amount of removal. So this indicates that the more we remove, the less of the carbon removed remains out of the atmosphere. And the values are lower 1,000 years after the pulse because of this continuing rebound in the atmospheric CO2 concentrations that I indicated earlier. So now let's look at how the response to negative CO2 emission compares to the response to positive emissions of the same magnitude. So these 4 panels illustrate the CO2 concentration, the surface air temperature change, the change in the land carbon reservoirs and ocean carbon reservoirs as a function of time. Positive pulses are indicated here in the positive domain, whereas removals or negative emissions are shown here in these negative domains of all panels. And what we're interested here is the asymmetry, so the extent to which the response to a negative emissions is equal and opposite to response to positive emission. And this asymmetry can be seen by comparing the solid lines to the dashed lines of the same color, which is the positive pulse mirrored into the negative emission domain. So this green dashed line here corresponds to this red line here. So that's the positive 500 gigaton emission, but then mirrored into negative space. And what we see here is that these lines, they differ from each other. So this is an indication that the carbon cycle response, but also the climate response, as we can see in this panel here at the top right, are asymmetric. This figure here makes the same point, but in a different representation. So what is shown here are now the change or the fraction of the changes in the different carbon reservoirs as a fraction of the pulse removal here on the left and the pulse emission here to the right. And so what we see here is that for the positive pulses, so emissions into the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide that remains in the atmosphere as a fraction of the emission increases with the pulse size, whereas the fraction of carbon in the atmosphere that remains out of the atmosphere decreases with pulse size. So this is an indication that the response is asymmetric. And what we can also see here is that the asymmetry increases with the size of the pulse. So it is relatively small for 100 gigaton emissions and removals, but it becomes quite large for 1,000 gigatons emissions and removals. And these asymmetries are caused by asymmetry in the ocean and the land that are due to nonlinearities in the response of both the land and the ocean carbon cycle to CO2 and climate change. This slide illustrates that the asymmetry in the carbon cycle response is independent of the initial CO2 concentration from which the pulse is applied. So it occurs for these yellow stars, which are emissions and removals applied at 2 times CO2, as well as for emissions and removals applied at a higher CO2 concentration of 4 times CO2, as indicated by these green squares here. So we see that for both initial concentrations, the fraction of CO2 remaining in the atmosphere increases with pulse size, whereas the fraction of CO2 remaining out of the atmosphere decreases with pulse size. And this is true for emissions and removals applied from different CO2 concentration levels. So what this means is that an emission is more effective at rising atmospheric CO2 concentrations than a removal is at lowering it. We see here that the asymmetry in the carbon cycle response is also visible in the temperature response. So let's look at this right panel here. So this is the ratio of surface air temperature change to the cumulative emissions or removals at year 100 after the pulse application. And again, what we see here for pulses applied for 2 times CO2 and 4 times CO2 is that the value decreases for positive pulses and increases for negative pulses. However, if we compare this with the asymmetry in the CO2 concentration, then we see that it is actually opposite. So whereas a CO2 emission, or the airborne fraction, which is the fraction of CO2 remaining in the atmosphere, increases with emission size, the warming effect of that emission decreases with emission size. And the opposite is true for negative emission pulses. And this is a result of the logarithmic relationship between radiative forcing and the atmospheric CO2 concentration. So to summarize, the CO2 removal fraction, which is the amount of CO2 that remains out of the atmosphere after a removal, decreases with increasing amount of removal and also increases with the background atmospheric CO2 concentration from which it is applied. The carbon cycle response to positive and negative CO2 emissions is asymmetric. And we showed that a negative emission is less effective at lowering atmospheric CO2 than a positive emission is at raising it. And we saw that the temperature response is also asymmetric. However, the sign of the asymmetry is opposite to that for CO2, in a sense that a negative emission is more effective at cooling than a positive CO2 emission is at warming. Thank you very much.